Here we go. Hi, Tori. Can we turn the recording off for the moment?
Hello.
Okay. You're good to go.
Thank you. So welcome everybody to day 3 of Virginia Woolf and Ethics. We've got panel HS2 today, Eco, Sense, and Sensibility. I'm very excited to hear these 3 speakers. So I think the way that we'll handle the panel today is I will introduce each speaker before their paper. And we will take probably about a 2-minute break between each paper so that people can collect themselves, move around, stretch. Day 1, very early, I was feeling like I was eager for the papers. I didn't really need the pauses, but by the afternoon of day 1, I was so grateful to have them and to have the chance to remember that I have a body and to move it around in between them. So we'll absolutely be taking a short pause before each paper and then one right before the Q&A. Okay. So it gives me a lot of pleasure today to introduce these 3 speakers. Today, first we have Savina Stevanato presenting a paper, Everything is Connected, Woolf's Ethical Craftsmanship. Savina Stevanato received her PhD from Universität, I'm going to mangle the Italian and I'm so sorry, Universität Venezia. She is currently teaching English literature at Roma University, yes, as a tenure-track research fellow. Her main research interests lie in the field of interart studies with a focus on the relationship between the verbal, visual, and musical codes in modernist literature. Her research has recently focused on the relationships between source theory, intertextuality, and intermediality. Her publications include the monographs, The Music of Poetry, T.S. Eliot and the Case of 4 Quartets, Visuality and Spatiality in Virginia Woolf's Fiction. Her essays focus variously on Shakespeare, Eliot, Woolf, Angela Carter, among others, Anima Mundi, an eco-pacifist reading of Virginia Woolf, 2021, Angela Carter, Gun for the Devil, 2020, Between the Acts of Hybrid Spaces, 2016, Hamlet's Distancing Devices, Verbal and Visual Marks of Modernity, 2016. I'm going to put an access copy for her paper into the chat for those of you who would like to answer the Google Doc. And Savina, please take it away.
Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Shilo, for your presentation, and thanks to the audience for your attention. I'll get straight to the point. So Woolf's ethical craftsmanship. Woolf's reading can and should be read from an ethical perspective, since it is based on a form of ethical thinking that is unconventional, feminist, and I'm thinking of Valérie's reading of Roma. It is also pacifist and ecological. This thinking reveals the firm grounding of her sense of equality, justice, and liberty in her empathetic respect for otherness and diversity, which connects to Moore's ethical ideas and to Bloomsbury's ethical aestheticism. In her macro text, the keen awareness of fragmentation and a highly relational sensibility go hand in hand and build up the beliefs that she voices as concerns both contents and forms. Her understanding of plurality and difference as variably vital and her focus on the need for interdependence characterize her peculiar brand of feminism and eco-pacifism on the one hand, and on the other, her poetics and formal beliefs related to literary craftsmanship. As regards her feminist pacifism, suffice it to think of the issues dealt with in some of her social critical writings, such as A Room, Professions for Women, 3 Guineas, A Thoughts and Peace in an Air Raid, and so on. Regarding the ecological issue, her macro text brims with examples of her elegiac respect for nature. Also copious are considerations for inanimate things, objects, forms, colors, a simple mark on the wall, as we all know. Now, I will read Woolf's Ethics of Respect, mainly from the viewpoint of on craftsmanship. A 1937 BBC talk that I find significance for its combined verbal and ethical perspective. because through a special functional import of both words and writing, she expresses some ethical key concepts that neatly parallel the many issues of mutual respect, valuable diversity, collaborative interrelations thematized throughout her writings. Now, although specifically relevant to the verbal domain, this ethics of respect drives the whole talk, denouncing various forms of violence, and to shed light on the close relationship between Woolf's respect for otherness and her deeply empathetic and ecosystemic sensibility, I will generally follow the discursive development of the talk, while occasionally suggesting relevant cross-references to other writings that you can follow on the slides, hopefully. Now, in this talk, Woolf stresses that the verbal world is an ecosystemic-like community because each individual word lives and signifies only mutual relation to other words. A word's meaning, she says, is not limited to its dictionary definition, but springs from the multiple interrelations it can establish with all other words, all with equal right of citizenship. Hence, their existence, semanticity, development, and permanence depend on their variety, diversity, and freedom. This allows words to perform their highly ethical task, quote, 1, which is to convey the truth. For Woolf, this ethical duty combines with the vital functions as testified in her 1933 diary, quote 2. I hope you can see them. The quote goes, "Only writing composes it," and she's referring to her own being. "Nothing makes a whole unless I am writing." So words and writing are essential because they are the instruments of an existential and aesthetic investigation into the nature of truth and art, both related to the concepts of wholeness, unity, and permanence. Words have a temporal nature, but their vanishing can be countered since, Woolf says, quote 3, "Words, if properly used, read patterned, seem able to live forever." So to her, the logos has both an ontological and a remedial value, which makes me think to Elsa's repetitive input she talked about 2 days ago. But let us pause to consider truth, which is not monolithic, but many-sided and implies plurality. It follows that to convey its multiplicity and complexity, words themselves must be, quote 4, various and complex. Now, this essential variety is consistent with the principles of biodiversity, which ensures the functioning of any kind of ecosystem. In turn, this entails mutual respect, since their diversity allows them to live, develop, breed meanings. Quote 5, "It is their nature to express 1,000 possibilities." This also explains the discrediting of usefulness because, quote 6, "A useful statement can mean only one thing and words mean many things." A focus on the value of heterogeneity is really paramount in many works by Woolf, and it significantly parallels that attributed to the term difference, for instance, in A Room, when she wonders, quote 7, "Ought not education to bring out and fortify the differences rather than the similarities?" Therefore, recognizing the value of difference and respecting it involves the consideration that such, let's say, polyphonic truth is told only if words manage to mutually relate and combine. And truth, quote 8, "How can we combine the old words and new orders so that they survive, create beauty, tell the truth?" Interaction and interdependence are necessary because, 9, words belong to each other. In that, 10, a word is not a single and separate entity. It is not a word, indeed, until it is part of a sentence. Now, this explains why words do not live in dictionary, but, quote 11, much as human beings do in the mind, strangely and variously. Though they do so in a less conventional way than we do, because words are better than we are, let's say, at being aware of and appreciating their mutual otherness. Thus also metaphorically downplaying social, gender, racial, national differences and boundaries. Quote 13, "Royal words mate with commoners, English words, American French words, German words, Indian words, Negro words." Now, words seem to cherish democracy and show tolerance once again to a greater extent than us, since, quote 14, "They believe that one word is as good as another. Uneducated words are as good as educated words, uncultivated words as cultivated words. There are no ranks or titles in their society." The following year, in 3 Guineas, Woolf likewise advised against all biased forms of hierarchy and exercise of power, suggesting that the only way to protect peace and freedom is to dismiss violence and collaborate. So, like words, humans do, if they wish to protect the continuation of life against the horror of war, must respect their mutual nature as outsiders to each other, by finding a way to cooperate without abusing each other in light of racial, gender, religious, or any kind of bias. The renunciation of power is directly connected to Woolf's discouragement of all forms of anthropo, andro, and egocentrism. And again, this is echoed by the verbal dimension of the talk. Indeed, given that the power of words also consists in providing the writer with suggestions, features, contents, and forms, to quote 15, without the writer's will, often against it, Woolf clearly minimizes the writer's own egocentric authority in favor of impersonality, communality, and intersubjectivity. Now, the same concept is echoed in her short stories, where nature lives freely and pays no particular attention to humans and knows peace. In The Mark on the Wall, for instance, quote 16, trees grow without paying any attention to us. And in the introduction, Lily hates being at a party celebrating male grandeur and would prefer to be alone in the woods, experiencing, quote 17, the pure beauty offered by beetles and lilies of the valley, without any care whatever what human beings thought to them. Now, similarly, androcentrism is also criticized in reference to nature and women. What Woolf defines in the talk again as, quote 18, the unnatural balance of much modern speech is related to man's dictatorial will to impose a single meaning by drawing precise borders, semantic as well as geographical. And these are equivalent to the will man exerts on a social and also environmental level over other human beings and over nature. And this further echoes 3 Guineas, where man is described as 19 from 3 Guineas, intent upon scoring the floor of the earth with chalk marks, within whose mystic boundaries human beings append rigidly, separately, artificially. And where even, quote 20, science is not sexless, she is a man, a father, and infected too. Thus infected science produced measurements to order. But words are poorly able to tolerate being mobilized, because words, quote 21, don't like being lifted out on the point of a pen and examined separately, because they hang together in sentences, paragraphs for whole pages. Now, words dislike being dissected and limited because truth implies plurality and mutability. And therefore, 22, they hate anything that stamps them with one meaning. Now, Woolf's ecosystemic sensibility is founded on her belief that only variety and complexity grant survival. And this holds true for words as well as for humans and nature. Quote 23, it is because of this complexity that they, words, survive. Perhaps then one reason why we have no great poet, novelist, or critic writing today is that we refuse words their liberty. We pin them down to one meaning, and when words are pinned down, they fold their wings and die. Besides the, let's say, ethical focus on respecting liberty, Woolf's choice of the verb pin is significant because it connects to the mummifying action of the patriarchal taxonomic science that she criticizes in 3 Guineas, as opposed, of course, to the new ecological and ethological sciences whose research focus has moved on to the mutual, changeable, various relationship between species. On the one hand, this new scientific interest in valuing interrelational fluidity replaces the will to order, define, fix by attaching labels and providing normative descriptions. On the other hand, and on the verbal level, it matches A, the fact that the meanings conveyed by words are also fluid, quote 24, and it matches B, the contemporary attempt of modern fiction to represent life as a living, complex, fleeting organism. I don't need to quote from modern fiction, but just think about the reference to the shower of innumerable atoms and the fact that life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Now, to succeed in this attempt to convey truth, Woolf stresses, quote 26, I'm back to the talk. It is only a question of finding the right words and putting them in the right order, creating a relational pattern based on respectful and inclusive interdependence. Here we find a different, let's say, positive kind of order that closely connects to words, and that is to Woolf, an existential, quote 27, revelation of some real thing behind appearances. And she makes it real by putting it into words. She makes it whole. And this is a quote from Moments of Being. Hence, verbal craftsmanship implies relational respect and relational expertise. And if this is generically true of the English language, it is much more so of artistic writing. Both ordinary and artistic craftsmanship need an ethics of respect. And this relates closely to what Woolf herself calls, quote 28, philosophy, to which I would add the adjectives relational and aesthetic, namely the revelation that behind phenomenal appearances, 28 again, is hidden a pattern that we are connected with this. So the word relation, interrelation, is a key word, both ethically and aesthetically. The ethical sense implies the search for how, 29, to find the right relation between the self and the world outside. This is the talk again. The aesthetic sense points to the compositional device Woolf also and often calls rhythm, based on a dynamics of interdependence intended, quote 30, to find the relation between things so that to create a whole and not a fragment. And this is a quote from a letter to a young poet. So only respect for relation creates unity and sense. And this holds true for both words and humans. In 3 Guineas, Woolf deals with the lack of such ethics, wondering, quote 31, are not force and possessiveness very closely connected with war? And also stating that, quote 32, it seems as if there were no progress in the human race, but only repetition. Now today, 84, I guess, years later, we again hear sounds of the brink of disaster, could say so. But as emerges from this talk, well, from whichever text by Woolf we carefully consider, she always encourages a constructive critical reflection that may be of great relevance to current global issues of power dynamics related to society, politics, gender, and the environment. Now, in doing so, she also and simultaneously reveals the interdependence between aesthetic and formal considerations and ethics. On the level of content, this confirms her great respect for inclusiveness, for all forms of otherness, and for intersubjective experience. On the level of form, it testifies to the connection between plurality and unity, fragments and totality, the parts and the whole, which makes a prose always strive for and achieve a complex and highly relational form in which, in Mrs. Ramsay's words, the whole is held together because, and finally, and these are Winterson's words, everything is interconnected. Now, this is the truth words convey, which is both intellectual / literary and ethical. To recognize it, we must learn to respect otherness and enter a relational dynamics of interdependence. With this talk, I guess that Woolf invites listeners and readers to meet a precise and double ethical demand, to deal ethically with words and behave as words do ethically. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Savina. We're going to take a 2-minute break. And while we're doing that, we had trouble actually, I could see the access copy, but our participants in the panel couldn't. So maybe we can change while we're taking that break, you and I can work on the permissions. If you change them, I'll be into share with everybody.
I could also simply just upload a PDF copy.
I think that would work very well if you're comfortable with that as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, okay. I'll do it right now. Okay.
We have several requests for the access copy, so we can even look at it during the break. So. So we'll have our next paper at 25 after the hour.
I hope you can see it now. Okay, fine.
Yes, I was able to download it, so thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
We got a heart from Bara. That means that she can access it as well. So we're good.
Sorry for the inconvenience. I don't know what happened with the paper, but
I think perhaps I could see it. So when we did our check earlier,
yeah, it
was that you had shared it with me. So anyone, I think you expressly shared it with me, but I couldn't even copy the document, so I couldn't fix it while you were speaking. Right. So I'm very sorry.
Okay.
Okay, it's now 25 after the hour, so I'll give everybody a chance to come back and I'll introduce our second speaker for the panelists. So our second panelist today is Stefano Rozzoni. Stefano will be presenting a paper, Land Ethics and the Land, Trajectories Across Sackville-West, Woolf, and Issues of Human-Nonhuman Relationality. Stefano is a PhD candidate in Literary and Cultural Studies at the University of Bergamo, Italy, in co-tutel with the Graduate Center for the Study of Culture at Justus Liebig University in Germany. He has submitted his dissertation dedicated to a reevaluation of the pastoral in Edward Marsh's collection, Georgian Poetry, 1911 through 1922, through a perspective combining eco-criticism and post-human studies. He is soon publishing papers on Woolf and eco-fascism and on Woolf and post-humanism. He loves gardening and reading Vita Sackville-West's poems. And I'm going to read this because he put it in the bio, but he's a big fan of Shilo McGiff's work on Woolf and the pastoral. But I will say that the admiration goes both ways. So I'm very excited to hear your paper today. Stefano, thank you for being so generous.
No, thank you for the work you're doing. Okay, let's set the time. Okay, first of all, okay, thanks everybody for taking the time to come to this beautiful panel. Okay, I'll screen share and we start. Okay, I hope that everything works with the with my connection. In case it doesn't, Shilo, I just sent you the PowerPoint presentation in case, because sometimes the connection here doesn't work very well. Okay, let's start. This is the program of my 15 minutes introduction. Then I'm going to focus on this concept of land ethic or ethics. And let's try to see how we can take it from the past and somehow re-narrate it for the present. And then I will try to connect it to Vita Sackville-West, and then we'll see a couple of passages of the land to see how they resonate with this concept which I'm building. And then there will be some conclusion and new openings for a project I have to do, and maybe you can help me find some ideas. Okay, this is due a beautiful memory of my first conference, which again was focused on Vita Sackville-West, which is one of my passion, and I hope that I will dedicate more time on her in the future in terms of research. And so me and Drew. Okay, my approach to Woolf studies very quickly, just to underline what is the perspective I'm talking from. First of all, there is cultural studies, but particularly this German perspective made in Gießen, which is aims to stress very much the connection between literature and culture, specifically exploring how not only literature is useful to better understand the world we live in, but also how literature can make an impact on culture and somehow some changes, okay, in the world we live in. And then there's eco-criticism. Particularly, I'm interested in this idea by Hubert Zapf, which focuses on the idea of look at the past, so reread the archives of literature through the perspective and the knowledge that we have today after this huge discussion on ecology, environment, and etc. And Jonathan Bate with this notion of ecopoiesis, which once again stresses this connection between poems, poetry, and the real world, so the impact of literature. And then there's posthumanism, as you know, everybody else, I guess, Rosie Berdotti and Donna Haraway, inspiring people to steal from. And in this perspective, I'm focusing on some works on Virginia Woolf, particularly, once again, the waves and everything connected to the presentation and the discussion on the environment. And then there's Sackville-West, and my focus is on Georgian poets, and maybe I will say something about it. But my interest in Vita and Virginia has always been focused on trying to go beyond these two major narratives, which I see connected to Vita Sackville-West. The first, which in my opinion, limit Vita to being Virginia Woolf's lover. I see that there's a lot of attention in this sense. I would be curious to focus more on her work and to reflect on their relationship, but more on a literary level. This would be, I think it's something that still needs to be worked on. And yeah, so instead of the two of them, it would be interesting to reflect on their respective books and works. So this is where I'm trying to fit myself. Land ethic, old concept, but still valid, in my opinion, if it is regarded through the philosophy that we experience today. And that's why I put this S, not only because on the one hand, it allows me to somehow pluralize this term. I'm not so sure you can pluralize ethic, but maybe yes, maybe no, but still the idea of pluralizing it in a very Haraway sense makes sense to me, just to make sure that you don't think I'm using this old-fashioned concept deriving, from old scholars, Aldo Leopold. This is where it comes from. But still, there's something that he said that makes sense to me if I want to work on Vita Sackville-West works, which, as everybody knows, have to do with land a lot. Okay, and so the concept of ethic in his perspective has to do with this idea of being a guidance for ecological situations, and still stressing the idea of being an individual and having the capacity to choose certain directions in your relationship with the land. So the land is not just the soil, of course, but it's about all the connectedness, this concoction of living beings, which we find in the environment with us. And I know this land ethic has been widely criticized for this notion of beauty, but yes, still, let's try and see how we can get what we can get from it and how we can use it to work as a lens for reflecting on Vita Sackville-West. And there's Sandra Ho stressing the fact that in the chair, in the past 30 years, we have experienced a lot, and a lot has happened in academia. So we cannot forget this eco-criticism, digital humanities, posthumanism. So when I say land ethics with the S, I intend to just put somehow everything in, this S. Particularly the discussion by Rosie Berdotti, so the idea of focusing on a perspective which is non-strictly dualistic, which is not anthropocentric, but it's plural. There's a new subjectivity we probably should keep in mind, which is the combination is pluralistic. It's not one, it's many. I think we're all familiar with these kind of concepts. But yeah, this image of, you know, different colors combining makes so much sense to me in my approach to this land ethics, which I decided to just write in colors because probably it stresses once again the pluralism, and it's also an homage to probably the Pride Month starting, you know, a few days ago. Very linear timeline, but we need it. We need it because we can place on it 1949, the text which have been discussed by me, but also we can place, you know, the Woolf period. So there is a certain closeness between Virginia Woolf and this text, not only in, I mean, time-wise, but what I want to say is that there might be connections, right, with Virginia Woolf works, Sackville-West works, and this whole discussion going on in this period regarding new relationalities, new kind of relationality between humans and non-humans. And therefore, the land and the waves, I guess, need to be explored, and all the texts of this period in relation to this combination and complexity of a complex discursive landscape, which has to do with this new ethics, new ways of perceiving the relationality between human and non-humans, which is what I was trying to do with my PhD thesis, focusing on Georgian poets, because we don't have to forget that a few years before we had somebody like Darwin, you know, coming up with these new ideas on human beings and animals, or somebody else like George Eliot translating Spinoza in England. So this whole landscape is, to me, important to retrace and to delineate some trajectories in my perspective on Sackville-West. So let's try and delve into this complexity. There have been some scholars who focused on the fact that the land was written in a moment, of course, when the countryside was changing, because we had technology coming in, fertilizers, pesticides, and tractors. But to me, it would be more interesting to explore the novelties in discourse at the time. So the question is, can we read the land, Sackville-West, the land, looking for aspects of novelty in this ethical discursive patterns, which was developing at that time, and which brought to something like the waves or the Sen County Almanac. So Virginia Woolf and land ethics, in this sense, there's no time to talk about, but I think we've been discussing this for the past 10 years, thanks to the work of brilliant scholars, which I also see them joining this panel, and now I feel a little anxious, but thank you for all the work that you did, because you finally stressed that in modernism, there is space for this discussion. And there is, you open the door on this complexity, which I would say needs to include something which appears traditional, but it might have something modern in a sense. And The Land, which is a very traditional poem, as we all know, in my opinion, still have aspects of modernity in the way it treats certain discussions on human and non-human relationality. So this is what my thesis, basically. So I would like to inscribe myself in this trajectory, which I delineated here with red. Vita Sackville-West, there is this narrative going on about her as a gardener, as a rural somehow woman, and these pictures focus on this story. This also needs to be re-narrated, because we need to go deeper in the idea that the countryside is not just this traditional, pastoral, beautiful place, but there is a complexity, okay, in this ecology. Okay, so let's try and get rid of this Wikipedia basic version of her as Mia Gardner, but let's try to explore how she engaged with this idea of human-on-human connectedness. These are just quotes which stress the idea of her being an aristocrat, wearing pearls and going gardening. There's much more than that. This is what I'm saying. The land, there's been some research, but only recently we have someone focusing a little bit on this eco-critical perspective, even though Matthew Griffiths, I noticed, is maybe still focused on this metaphorical comparison between the idea of working hard on the soil, working hard in the garden, and the difficulties that we may experience when we want to solve the environmental crisis today. I would like to take a step further and try to enter this more philosophical discussion. So let's now try and see a couple of sections of this poem where I see traces of this discussion. So this comes from the first part of the poem, where the lyrical eye is talking about the countryside, right? And here, so it refers to the countryside, this rural world, meet and marry many harmonies, and all harmonies being ultimately one. Once again, this idea of connectedness to me is very, I'm being very quick here, but it's quite evident. And I also like the linguistic effect, which combines human and non-human in the image of the sickle in hand, so the tool that you use in the garden, and the sickle in the sky. Yeah, so which is the moon. So, but this idea of having the same word for two different concepts, one which is natural, one which is not natural, sounded to me as a possibility to reflect on this sense of human and human connectedness, as well as this passage where we see, you know, it's dedicated to this Greek goddess of Proserpina, of, you know, this Greek myths of fertility. So we have this woman walking, and I like the lexicon, the vocabulary here. So as she walks, each flower is her son and trees a daughter. So this idea of kin, once again, as Savina was talking about it, relationality, parenthood, post-human parenthood makes sense to me. Or this, you know, the use of the verb prune my ambition. As far as I know, prune is very much like a verb that you adopt when you describe what you do in the garden. But here, the fact that she uses ear as a way to describe, human feelings is, it's an interesting use of lexicon, which combines both with the human and the non-human. There's also an issue of epistemology, which goes into complexity. It's not just about eyes, but it's vision when you have to do with the natural world. So it sounds to me like a deeper thing. Or there is this passage which focuses on the idea that book learning, so people would stress or stay confined to learning this relationality on a theoretical level, miss something which they can get when they go to the experience. So different kind of relationality. So, and there are other examples which, stress the idea of this paradoxical relationality with human beings and the land. On the one hand, there is a lot of work, there's violence, there is taking the sources and resources, but at the same time, there is a reward and there is a sense of being in connectedness, let's say that. Yeah, the conclusion basically is that what I'm interested in doing is to try to retrace these elements coming from contemporary philosophy and try to create a dialogue between them and this poem. I think there's space. And why we have to do this? Because we live in a world which is a mess. This is, and I'm concluding here, a newspaper article from a local newspaper here, which came out today. This is just a wood which disappeared because they have to build a supermarket. And what I'm doing, little activism, I pull up the issue of ethic, because we need to look for this new way of thinking human and non-human. And what I'm thinking here, maybe we need to read Vita Sackville-West in this way because there's a necessity today. So what I'm planning to do is a poem reading session in that place where the wood has disappeared. Because maybe, I don't know, there's these passages that we just saw today may, I don't know, inspire somebody to, develop different politics in dealing with the environment. Okay, and that's it. Thanks, grazie.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I look forward to maybe hearing a bit more about that in the Q&A, to hear about your activism. That strikes me as such an interesting way to bring together your interest in performance, poetry, and activism at the same time, to have a reading there. So I look forward to hearing more about that in the Q&A. We'll take a 2-minute break, or almost like a 1-minute break, 1.5-minute break, and sort of reconvene at about 46 after the hour to hear our third paper. And in the meantime, would you mind if I shared the PDF that you sent me with everybody here, so that you went very quickly through some of your slides, and I definitely found that I wanted to look at some of the passages longer.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you. They seem like such rich passages, so I want to be able to linger with the text of it. So thank you.
I will maybe take this moment to set up the PowerPoint in case it takes a while, so that's not a problem. Is it visible? Does it work fine? Thanks.
It works for me, and I did double check to see that I could share it. And because I could share it, I think that others will be able to see it, Anya.
Thanks.
But it would be good to hear if that works for others.
I can see it.
Awesome. Great. So as we're finishing up some thoughts on Stefano's presentation, I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to come back so that I can introduce our third speaker. Our third speaker today is Anya Potoczny, who will be giving us a paper entitled Anon to the Lighthouse and Posthumanist Authorship. Anya is a recent graduate of the University of Warsaw, where she obtained her master's degree in English literature. Her research interests include feminism and posthumanist theory, as well as the intersections between the two, posthumanist approaches to subjectivity, animal studies and animal ethics, new materialism, and modern and contemporary British women's writing.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you, Shilo. And yeah, right, so hope the PowerPoint is visible right now. So perhaps, and hope the access copy works well as well. So that's the case, then let's start. So The Lighthouse is largely a novel of crisis, and intimacy and connections in a novel are sought as the harmonious, late Victorian world, hitherto unknown to the characters, being shattered to pieces among the all-encompassing havoc wreaked by the war and the following general disenchantment. Writing about the new vision of the human after 1900, Matt Rosendale-Thompson accurately notes that collective narratives and multiple voices constitute an antidote to disenchantment of the modernist era, and that Woolf's fiction revolves around a search for intensity and moments that raise one above others. The following paper builds from the idea that Woolf's characters seek is not necessarily, and certainly not always, to be raised above. On the contrary, they quite often prove to be, to quote Donna Haraway, creatures of the mud, not of the sky. Further,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You might be covering your microphone at intervals because your sound is coming in and out. So
is that better now?
Much better. I just really want to be able to hear your paper.
Didn't
Thank
change
you.
Much, but
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Yes.
No worries.
Please feel free to start again if you want to. Yes,
sure.
Thank you.
Let's do that. Okay. Sorry for that. All right. So as I've already started saying, sorry for the technical issue. So The Lighthouse is a large novel of crisis, and intimacy and connection in the novel are sought as the harmonious late Victorian world, hitherto known to the characters, is being shattered to pieces among the all-encompassing havoc wrought by the war and the following general disenchantment. Writing about the new vision of the human after 1900, Matt Rosnell-Thompson accurately notes that collective narratives and multiple voices constitute an antidote to disenchantment of the modernist era, and that Woolf's fiction revolves around a search for intensity and moments that raise one above others. The following paper builds from the idea that Woolf's characters seek is not necessarily, and certainly not always, to be raised above. On the contrary, they quite often prove to be, to quote Donna Haraway, creatures of the mud, not of the sky. Further, Thompson asserts that The Lighthouse offers a lyrical portrait of coexisting impressions of reality, a fantasy of a shared space, which nevertheless remains a fantasy, and that's a quote. And scholars such as Dominic Sheck claim that Woolf's 1927 novel progressively reveals the impossibility of a holistic image of human coexistence. Other critics, notably Bonnie Kim Scott, insist on a certain type of holism being an inherent quality of Woolf's worldview and literary activity. Analysing the writer's over through an eco-feminist lens, she posits that Woolf's traumatized, usually female character seek solace by conceiving fantasies of all-encompassing environmental unity. And exploring points of crisis and breakthrough, both general and creative, occurring throughout the novel, the following paper argues that Woolf proposes what could be described as a post-humanist refiguration of the idea of authorship and creation. And I will attempt to illustrate this through referring to Woolf's much later text, Anon, which posits art, specifically literature, as an inherently non-individualistic communal activity. And further, I use Donna Haraway's theory of simple eases, one she theorized in her book Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin the Tool Theme, to examine the more than human collaborations involved in meaning-making and word-making, or, in Haraway's words, worlding, building from the assumption that neither of the two is solely a human domain, and that various organisms engage together in activities that could and even ought to be considered forms of creative work. And defining simple eases as visible on a slide, the author writes, simple ease is a simple word, it means making with. Nothing makes itself, nothing is really autopoietic or self-organizing. Simple ease is a word proper to complex, dynamic, responsive, situated historical systems. It is a word for wording with and company. Simple eases enforce autopoiesis and transfers and extends it. So additionally, far from proposing any vision of natural wholeness, Haraway's idea of interspecies collaboration focuses on localized narratives and temporary entanglements. Mortal critters, and that's a quote, entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, meanings. And beginning to question, coming back to the novel now, beginning to question all he has believed with regard to his role as an intellectual on the essence and grandeur of civilization, Mr. Ramsay seems to take a step towards such collaborative concept of culture making. And the vaguely pre- and post-humanist overtone of his conclusions is strongly informed by his physical environment, which works to destabilize the anthropocentrism and androcentrism inherent in his thinking.
Anya, we can't hear you at all now.
Really?
It's like you're very, very, very far away.
Okay.
So when you're facing, no, better. When you're, I think it has something to do with where you're facing.
All right. Sorry for that.
That is currently better.
Okay. So for how long? Was I inaudible?
for quite a while. It completely audible for about a minute and a half, I think.
Okay.
There's
right.
Transcription has been enabled in the chat, so people can look at that, and we do have your access copy.
Yeah. So, yeah. All right. Is it okay if I start from what I've been talking about just now?
Yes, absolutely. Please do. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe the moment to start off again would be going back to the novel, to the Lighthouse. So beginning to question all he has believed with regard to his role as an intellectual and the essence and grandeur of civilization, Mr. Ramsay seems to take a step towards such a collaborative concept of culture making. The vaguely pre- and post-humanist overtone of his conclusions, strongly informed by his physical environment, which works to destabilize the anthropocentrism inherent in his thinking. And the scene I'm talking about is the one in which, I'm sure everyone knows this very well, the one in which he thinks about how the very stone one kicks with one's bit towards last Shakespeare, and how his own little light would shine not very brightly for a year or two, and what then would emerge in some bigger light, and then in a bigger still. And very importantly, he looked into the darkness, into the intricacy of twigs. So a striking instance of Ramsay's disillusionment with the notion of individual greatness, the passage implies that the progress of civilization is of a communal intersubjective nature, and that the aim of contributing to the wealth of philosophical thought, or for that matter, any other element of cultural and intellectual heritage, requires foregoing one's egotistical craving for recognition. Ramsay imagines himself as a small light joining progressively larger glow, yet what he simultaneously looks at are twigs forming a hedge. Both images depict relatively small elements that form a whole by merging together, after which one cannot unambiguously tell where one ends and the other begins. Gazing into the web of interconnected branches, he observes a pattern that might not only act as an inspiration for the light metaphor, condensing the crucial role of literary and intellectual influence, but also recapture the time when the name of the author was of no significance whatsoever, and when the first poet, the quote, emerged from the continuity of wild grasses and bubbling song, as Bonnie Scott very beautifully puts it, writing about Anon. So Woolf's Anon has no concept of following a path of progress, and neither did he think of his verse as a piece of individual oeuvre. Therefore, he was not responsible, not self-conscious, both quotes, Ramsay's polar opposite. Woolf claims that one may reconstruct Anon's experience of the world by overlooking the traces of civilization and tuning oneself into, quote, the bird-haunted reed whispering fen, end of quote, or the darkness lurking among the twigs of a neat hedge on the edge of a middle-class garden. After all, both the anonymous playwright and his audience are, quote, not yet dead in ourselves. And the darkness and intricacy of twigs are all the more significant as they shift the focus away from him who Haraway describes as the self-making human, the human-making machine of history, that was a quote, by referring to Ursula Le Guin's career-back theory of storytelling. Full quote of Haraway elaborating on Le Guin can be seen here. The theory emphasizes the productive life-giving property of holes, hollows, and nooks. Quote, those concave, hollowed-out things, these holes in being, end of quote, necessary carriers of meaning and containers for narratives, open-ended structures which never revolve around hero worship. Quote, the slight curve of the shell that holds just a little water, just a few seeds to give away and receive, suggest stories of becoming with, of reciprocal induction, companion species whose job is living and dying is not to end the stirring, the wording, end of quote. So the wording taking place among the darkness of the hedge adds Ramsay's newly discovered humility and a more horizontal vision of artistic authority and influence. Woolf employs similar imagery for Nancy and Andrew's exploration of the beach together with Paul and Minter, pulling her characters towards the verge of the cultivated world. Having found a little pool by a rock when anemones are stacked and innumerable minnows swim, Nancy creates a little tide, disturbing the sea creature's tiny universe. This is the scene talking about right now. So let me find my place again. And then as she raises her eyes to gaze at the skyline blurring with the sea, the enormity overwhelms her and, quote, the true senses of the vastness and tininess flowering within it made her feel that she was bound hand and foot and unable to move by the intensity of feeling which reduced her own body, her own life, and the lives of all the people in the world forever to nothingness.
Rather than from the sublime image of the seemingly boundless horizon, Nancy's moment of being originates from her sense of in-betweenness and from the newly discovered awareness of the very real possibility of her own annihilation. And at one moment, quote, she changed the pool into the sea and cast vast clouds over this tiny world by holding her hand against the sun, and so brought darkness and desolation, like God himself, to millions of ignorant and innocent creatures. And end of quote. And what follows is a shocking realization that she and her own environment are too within the sea's reach, and that they are all at the mercy of bigger and harness forces. However, unlike the immediately following discovery of impellment to kissing, her encounter with the sea is hypnotizing rather than unequivocally traumatic. The proposal of manipulating the anemones in a fish as little cosmogony constitutes Nancy's creative act, which requires cross-species involvement. Wording of living and dying, that's a quote from Haraway, of becoming with and unbecoming with, which, as the critic proposes, constitutes the one possible productive response to the threat of extinction, a response which looks neither to the idealist past nor fatalistically to the future, but rather remains, quote, tuned to the senses, to mindful matter, to material semiotics, to mortal earthlings and thick presence. So, pools, nooks, and holes retain their artistic, natural, cultural significance throughout the novel as submerged in the, quote, deep basin of reality. Lily Briscoe struggles to complete her painting, and recalling Tanz's disdain for women's artistic and literary activity, the main source of her own insecurity as a painter, she fiddles absent-mindedly with an anthill. There were ants crawling about, that's a quote, among the plantains, which she disturbed with her brush, red, energetic ants, rather than like Charles Tansley, end of quote. Just a little check, is the sound okay? Or Thank you. Okay, similar to Nancy's Little Pool, the colony constitutes a micro-universe unfolding alongside the human community. Interpreting this creative process through the lens of embodied cognition, Melba Kodakine proposes that the artist resolves her internal tension by mimicking her mental state with the activity of her hands and the way she alters the insect's landscape, first, quote, raising a little mountain for the ants to climb over, thereby, quote, reducing them to a frenzy of indecision by this interference in their cosmogony, and by, quote, again, smoothing the way for her ants afterwards as she ponders on Ramsay's marriage. While concurring with Kodakine's observation regarding the significance of bodily experience for a non-Cartesian reading of To the Lighthouse, I suggest that as with plenty of other non-human animals appearing throughout the novel, the role of the ants themselves transcends that of the useful tool for an otherwise anthropocentric narrative. Instead, the interference, whether destructive or constructive, is undoubtedly mutual, and seeing the insects dispersed by her own design and then reunited pushes her closer to her artistic vision by helping her reconcile the past with the present, assembling multiple ways of seeing. Initially fixated on patriarchal judgment and potential or experienced hostility, Lily begins to achieve clarity when she derives, quote, a sense of repetition from her memories of the Ramsays, of one thing falling, that's a quote, when another had fallen, and so setting up an echo with chiming in the air and made of full vibrations. So what the painter realizes is the liberatory power of a cyclical, non-linear, and non-progressive turn of events. Explaining the etymology of her neologism Cthulhu, Haraway too proposes a new temporality for crisis-ridden times. So elaborating on the second component of this neologism Cthulhu, Haraway writes that kainos means now, a time of beginnings, a time for ongoing for freshness. Nothing in kainos must mean conventional past, presents, or futures. There is nothing in times of beginnings that insists on wiping out what has come before, or indeed wiping out what comes after. Kainos can be full of inheritances of remembering and full of comings of nurturing might still be. So similarly attuned to all things material, that, quote, common voice singing out of doors, having emerged out of the forest and settled down, Anon, inspired perhaps of Woolf hypothesizes by birdsong, became the poetic voice of the community, weaving into his lyrics universally relevant experiences of the body, joy, hunger, cyclicality of the seasons, and the transit of all things. Lily's artistic endeavors, too, strive to convey both bodily experiences, to quote Woolf, the emotions of the body, and the aforementioned inheritances. After all, she attempts to capture a vision of the deceased Mrs. Ramsay, whose absence makes the necessity of depicting her all the more pressing. Similarly to Nancy, Lily stretches her perception between the tiny microcosm of the anthill and the larger landscape comprising the sea, the lighthouse, and eclipse, and according to Kadakeen, the very scope of her literal vision. The move from the local to the general facilitates Lily's artistic progress. One could additionally claim that Lily's sudden enlightenment is informed by her visual and tactile interactions with the immediate surroundings and by her embracing a horizontal idea of a collaboration and influence. The artist's immediate visual impression of the aquatic space and the shore confronts her with the pre-human and the larger than human, and not only that, but her impression that, quote, the cliffs looked like they were conscious of the ships, puts forward the idea, now scientifically plausible, of the possibility for, quote, communication with the abiotic world from sand to gas to rock. Lily must suspend her modern sense of temporality and individuality, embracing the cyclical and repetitive. She, quote, keeps a distance from the present moment, the unwanted judgmental gaze, the self-consciousness, Bergman hostility that threatens to engulf her, and only then can she succeed at truly capturing Mrs. Ramsay. I propose that Lily's art is of deeply ethical nature, precluding self-consciousness and driven by the ethical obligation, to quote Donna Haraway, to stir up potent response to devastating events, as well as to settle troubled waters and rebuild quiet places when faced with a life-shattering crisis. While the final vision is said to be her own, the preceding creative process was driven by the thought that, quote, one wanted 50 pair of eyes to see Mrs. Ramsay with. And what she might be thereby recognizing is the elusive thrill of being, quote, part of the nature of things. Citing Richard Dawkins' aesthetic enchantment with Darwin's theory of evolution, Thompson asserts that the latter, quote, shifts the focus from objects to processes, from individual events that may be perceived to traces that may be seen as parts of an evolution of time that extends far beyond history. The stone bountifully outlived Shakespeare's fame, the anemones in a fish, as well as the sea, perpetually washing over the boundary of civilization, they all constitute such prehistoric primordial traces. Opening herself up to the non-obvious influences of, if not implicit, collaboration with both the non-human and the pre-human reality, which enables non-individualist, post-Cartesian approach to culture, Lily excavates from within herself the need for communal creation, the primal necessity for expression that has not always been the domain of the admired and celebrated few. She feels fully at peace with the possibility that her painting, quote, would be hung in the attics, would be rolled up and flung under a sofa, anonymous, fulfilling narcissistic wishes of no one, co-created by various forces, human and non-human, timeless, relevant in its marginality, as the quote will, but even so, it is true. Thank you very much. These are the references. Very sorry for the technical issues. I really did not expect that. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya. The transcription has been enabled, so people perhaps could scroll back to things that we have missed. Thank you, Tori, for enabling that on the fly. So we'll take just about a minute and for us to sort of regroup, maybe sketch down some questions, and then we'll come back. So I want to make sure that we have enough time for the Q&A for a rich discussion. Thank you so much. Wonderful. All right, I'd like to invite us all back for the Q&A. And we have we have at least 2 screens of participants in this room. So as you have a question, it would be great if you could cue yourself by using the reaction to the hand to raise your hand, and that way we'll jump to the top and I'll be able to call on you. So also feel free to put any of your reactions or questions in the chat, and we'll pose them to our panelists. Who would like to start us off? Peter, please.
Hi, thank you to all the panelists for such a rich, thought-provoking series of papers. My question is for Stefano. I was really pleased to see the land getting some attention. I'm also, love that long poem. And I was wondering if you could say, it's really interesting to think about Leopold's land ethics and modernism. And if you could say if there are differences, as you see it, between an English pastoral tradition and an American pastoral tradition. And I'm wondering whether with someone like Sackville-West, this has something to do with class and the economic relation to the land. I'm thinking about Sackville-West's slightly romanticized idea of class, perhaps, with workers on the land. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about the difference between English and American pastoralism.
Okay, thank you very much for the question, and thank for the work that you're doing, because I am following your work, and the modernist Anthropocene is something which we needed. So thank you. Okay, as per your question, big question, but well, from what I see, there is this idea to consider these 2 different trajectories in focusing on the pastoral, which go back to Williams and the other one who wrote The Machine and the Garden, whose name now disappeared in my mind. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. Yeah, at the same time, I think this is the right environment to be also provocative, right? In my environment, in my idea, I think that this maybe could be rethought because if we follow a more historical approach to the literary work we analyze, it makes sense to just focus on this distinction and go back on a more philological, theoretical perspective. In my view nowadays, we are getting, there's complexity involved, we're getting things together, and the pastoral acquires meaning. And we've got this label, the necropastoral, and Shilo was mentioning yesterday, which could be adapted, in my opinion, to different things. And that's why I, adopted 100% American text to like an English author in this sense. But I'm also rethinking the concept. So my question will be to you, what do you think about working in this way? Because even you mentioned class and these social issues. Yeah, I definitely see them. But at the same time, I wonder if we focus on how this text may produce meaning today, can we, I don't want to say forget, but leave this discussion on class a little aside to give space to other things? Because at the end of the day, we cannot put in all the issues that a text has inside it. So do you think my approach is naive, or there's a possibility to go in this direction? Thank you, Peter.
No, I won't say too much. I don't want to take over the question time, but yeah, just briefly, I think that's a really, not naive at all, very interesting idea of sort of bringing 2 theoretical models of the pastoral into dialogue with one another and across historical differences. I think that's really promising and hasn't been done enough. So I will leave it. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Derek, please.
Thank you. Another excellent panel. And I just wanted to come in really because it follows on quite nicely from Peter's question for Stefano. Because it strikes me that, you know, one of the things that's so rich about your approach and the fact that you're returning to Vita, which, you know, I echo the sentiments that that's a very important thing to do, is that it does open on to these kind of intersecting issues around class, as Peter was saying, but also queerness and sexuality. I'm thinking Peter's actually written a lovely chapter on Bloomsbury and nature, which talks a little bit about Vita Sackville-West, the land. And he picks out this lovely phrase of the, I hope I've remembered it rightly, the tangled mesh. Is that right, Peter? From the land, as one of the moments in the imagery that helps her to kind of move away from a kind of heteronormative view of the land that's associated with fertility. So it's this queer moment in the text, a moment of queer nature and queering nature in that poem. And I think, Peter, I mean, you should really be saying this, but I think, you know, the way Peter reads that is this is one of the moments where we get the modernist Vita Sackville-West rather than, you know, the more conservative reading of her poetics. So I guess I just wondered whether queerness is something that's going to come more and more into your reading of Woolf and Vita Sackville-West, because it would very much be a way to connect the reading that you're offering and the engagement with posthumanist theorists and eco-criticism and so on with some of the work that's been done in the past. For example, Suzanne Rait's book on Vita in Virginia, where she explores questions of sexuality. So any thoughts on that would be really interesting.
Thanks, Derek. Again, you are a person who I'm following a lot. So thanks for the work you're doing. Nice to meet you. No, this concept makes sense to me because I've always thought that this may be the transition of studies on Vita Sackville-West from these gender studies, which as much as they open, I'm provocative, as much as they open, they restrict visions. Okay, because she, in my view, was, you know, put in this box and stayed there for a while. Okay, because queerness has penetrated this environmental discourse as well, as you said, to me would be a natural prosecution of the discussion on a more wider sense. Not queer in the gender studies sense, but also queer in the environmental humanities / posthuman sense. But I would leave it to somebody else because this is not a concept I use a lot, but I think that we can arrive to similar conclusion to different patterns. And I'm not using this just because I'm not an expert of queer and queer studies. I know that there's a huge universe of theory that I don't have time to do because I'm reading posthumanism and environmental. But the other way I'm exploring, it happened to have this book. There is this posthuman feminism book, Rosi Braidotti again, which makes so much sense to me because in a slightly different way from this queer penetrating into environmental studies, explores similar things. And this is what I am exploring now. So taking from this scholarly tradition on Vita and expand it to this environmental humanities, which is also very wide label. So, but let's work on it.
Yeah, no, I completely understand what you're saying. It can be quite overwhelming to think, you know, so now I need to include queerness and class and national divides. And I think actually I'm sort of thinking about the model of the presentation that Shilo gave yesterday with Ben and Lacey, as maybe a way in which, you know, maybe next year we need a panel on Vita that includes these different elements in this kind of collaborative way, so that you get those intersections without feeling that every single thing you say about a particular poem or any text has to include and acknowledge all of those different aspects. Okay, thank you. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Derek. Yes, and there's a small plug, Lacey conference next year for Woolf and Ecologies in 2023 will be a wonderful opportunity for a project that Derek's just mentioned. Kelly, please.
I just wanted to direct that kind of question to Savina too, because I think it's interesting in terms of all of the ways in which these papers were showing we are interested as scholars in these interconnections. We want to have this ethics of widening, right, our view and our scope to see how imbricated all of these things are, which is something, Savina, you were talking about in the ethics of the way Woolf uses the word. And as people who use the word all the time, it is difficult to figure out. So if we are interested in these issues, what new shapes does our own writing, does our own thought process need to take? And Stefano, I really hear you in terms of, we talk about fatigue, but then the kind of work we're trying to do requires us to bring together volumes of scholarship that feels overwhelming. And so Savina, since you also mentioned music and art as other forms, I wondered if you could help us think about how do we take that ethics that you were talking about in terms of the way Woolf uses language, and how do you apply that to your scholarship, or how do you see that applying to music and to art as well?
Thank you for the question. I'm still working on it, and I will be working on it, because it is really, there are so many things just to think about. And the interest I have for this very small talk, Woolf stopped writing 3 guineas just to write it very quickly. But it is so significant to me, because she brings us back to the use of words, which is her basic tool and our basic tool. And I guess I'm a bit, obsessed with forms, because I'm always thinking, even when Anna talked about the all-encompassing environmental unity, for instance, so everything is interconnected. How does this translate into formal strategies? Thinking about the Lighthouse, for instance, can we detect formal strategies paralleling this unity? And I think yes, on the level of content, for instance, when we think about the painting, so art, and there you've got the painting and Lily, who tries very hard to get to this formal unity, and she it takes, of course, a long time for her, but she finally gets there. And I always thought that this is a metaphor for Woolf's own writing, because they are doing the same thing. So in a way, the painting is a meta-narrative, let's say, mirror to how words are used by Woolf. And so while I was writing this very small paper of mine, I was thinking how to relate to different issues, but not only issues, also formal ways that Woolf uses in her macro texts, which are really so many. So whenever we talk about, as in this case, a specific case of unity, I don't remember, well, let me see my notes, interspecies collaboration, and all those relationships between human and non-humans, how does this is translated into formal terms? That is what I'm interested in. And it is not only easy, because if you think about the experimental forms Woolf uses, I'm thinking about in between the acts, there is a passage deleted from the novel, where she deals with this anonymous voice, the narrator voice, who tries to see things and describe things not being there. So being there and not being there, which is another form of inclusiveness. So it is really a vast, there is a broad spectrum of things to be considered. And well, I just, let's say, chose a very small talk in order just to show how from such a small focus, you can really open it up to contents and forms at the same time, because I guess they form a really talks in terms of content if you analyze it, if you focus on I know it's something, critically speaking, it is an old perspective and somehow I don't know, old-fashioned maybe, but I truly believe that form is there to tell you something, how words work. You should always look at how they work. So I don't know if this is,
and I love the idea that the microcosm, that tiny microcosm, can be a mirror of complexity of the whole. I love that. I thought that came through really well. Thank you.
And I also wonder, I see Christina, I see your hand, and but I wanted to bring Anya into this discussion also, because I think what you're doing with Lily into the Lighthouse and the idea of sympoiesis actually speaks to this notion of sort of how we represent that interconnectedness in a specified form. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that in your paper, or your thoughts on that in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't really thought about it that much, because my idea was generally that this symbiosis is what enables this creation in the first place, this creation that's, well, maybe not necessarily feminist, but it departs from something that, it departs from this more, I don't know the word patriarchal is correct here, but this more androcentric, male-centric, this idea of progress, this idea of creation, and the very male idea of, and very vertical as well, this kind of concept of creating basically anything, cultural value. And I think the sympoiesis is essentially what allows Lily into the Lighthouse to abandon this idea and think about in more horizontal, more collaborative terms. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you. Christina.
I think I was thinking along similar lines, Shilo, and just wanting to pull out some of the sort of imagistic echoes between Anna's discussion of the microcosm of the minnows in the sea and the ants, and then Savina thinking of craftsmanship. I think when she's talking about words, there's also sort of a sense of almost observing, like kind of from an aerial perspective, kind of the words kind of interacting and so on. And so I was wondering if either of you have a sense of how Woolf kind of employs that sort of observing from above kind of perspective for the value that it has, but also the ways in which she perhaps kind of complicates or undercuts that sense of kind of that godlike position of observing from above. And it was partly just the connection between that image of sort of looking into a well or onto an anthill or into a pool of minnows that sort of set me thinking about the two papers in connection. But yeah.
If I may, if Anna wants to say something.
I'd love to hear from Anna.
Go ahead. Okay. I think it includes a kind of aporia in a way, because well, I hope I have understood your question in a proper way. But I think that Woolf is somehow mediating between a kind of authorship position, which is still traditional because it is godlike and you have to see everything from above. But she's always also trying to delete somehow or find a compromise with that position. And the passage, the deleted passage from between the acts, which I cannot find now, is really clear. And I don't think it is it is not by chance that it is written at the end of her career, because I guess she developed this expertise in trying to mediate between authorship in a traditional way and inclusiveness, but still you have to maintain your perspective. And this makes me think, and this is a question to you all, I guess, because I'm always wondering, can we really do without binarism? Can we really do without extremes? Because they still are reference points that allows you to see I don't know, for instance, the dynamics I other, for instance, and the fact that you can build subjectivity. And she explained this very well in the waves, for instance, but also into the Lighthouse, where you have to respect a certain distance between the subject and the object, be the object also a person, in order to create your subjectivity. So I don't know. There is this tendency towards inclusiveness and fluidity on the one hand, and on the other, the fact that you have to maintain, let's say, or accept the fact that you are apart, that you have some limits. So I don't know. It's something that really I'm still wondering, and I don't know if you have any suggestions about that.
Anya, did you want to pick up or respond at all to that?
So what I've been thinking about essentially is that, but from the entirety of Woolf's writing, I think we can get this idea that we can actually celebrate this fragmentariness, this impossibility of this whole unity that Savina has been talking about. I think she actually celebrates that we're all like microcosms, and that you really can't have any holistic vision of the world. That's what I thought. I don't know if it works.
Thank you. So we are at time for the panel. There are some really good questions in the chat, but I want to give everybody the opportunity to take advantage of the break. And if the panelists want to stay after and talk for a bit, or if you have questions, I'm very willing to stay. So I wanted to extend that invitation. We have some comments from both Ben and Lacey that it'd be lovely to sort of take up. But for the moment, thank you to all our panelists and for the great questions in the Q&A, and look forward to talking about these issues more too. In perhaps the roundtable on the Anthropocene, Virginia Woolf and the Anthropocene this afternoon. So thank you very much. Stefano, I also have questions for you. So if you want them, but we can always talk about them later.
No, let's talk about it.
So this is just the very first part of Ben's, it's the very first part of Ben's question, which is, it's very interesting in this timeline that you created. It stood out to me that you placed the land very close to the waves. And it was compelling to me in part because Emily Copley in her recent book, Virginia Woolf and Poetry, gives a really unvarnished account of what she basically essentially says is Virginia's disdain for Vita's verse. And I was really curious about their proximity, and if there's a way that you see the land as preceding the strategies of the land in some ways. Maybe it's the poetic strategies of the land as anticipating the waves in some way. I was wondering if that was an argument that you were making or something that you were looking for.
Thank you, Shilo. Well, in my limited perspective, I didn't really want to create like a genesis in relation to the land and the waves, but definitely the time Vita was writing the land was very much the moment where the bond was, very strong at the time, right? And I've always wondered if there have been some kind of verbal or non-verbal discussion about these issues of connectedness, because I've always thought that the waves does not come out of the blue. Mm-hmm. It's a combination of a lot of things, and I'm pretty sure that must be something also connected to and also probably we need to make a distinction between the land as a poem, so in its formal essence, and perhaps the philosophy behind it, which I think is something which resonates with this Woolfian land ethics, let's say that. Mm-hmm. So, and to me, this possible connection is something that needs to be explored more, but I'm not very interested in this philological, historical, we cannot enter a mind of an author. He or she is gone. And to me, it's more interesting to say how these texts dialogues today, because they can. And this is it's a different approach. In terms of post-human studies, there is this diffractive reading, which resonates very well with putting things together, even though it does not seem that they are connected, but they are. Simplifying it.
Does that provide, Ben, you had this great question about, symbiopoiesis, sympoiesis, and yes, maybe this would be a good opportunity to bring that in.
Yeah, so and Derek was very kind in the chat. I sometimes describe myself as a grouchy Deleuzian, right? I am a Deleuzian, but often when I read Bradotti or when I read others, I grimace. I'm somewhat frustrated often by what seems to me a kind of imprecise way of deploying Deleuze's work, or a kind of hyper-optimism, occasional hyper-optimism that is being sort of ascribed to this perspective. I'll set that aside, though. I don't want to worry about that. But one thing I worry about is the way in which terms like autopoiesis, sympoiesis, symbiopoiesis get sort of circulated. It seems to me there's very clear differences between these terms. But like when Bradotti writes about autopoiesis, the self-organizing of matter, it seems to me what she's really talking about is symbiopoiesis, which is a much more ecological term of how different organisms who are already shaped by matter co-develop together in uneven ways, unequal ways. Environments are not a place, they're not a utopian space of collaboration and communion and this or that. They're accidental, unpredictable, often violent, often catastrophic, often all of these sorts of things. And so it seems to me symbiopoiesis is a more precise term for understanding some of the dynamics in this theoretical framework. And I get that from Anna Singh's work on the global history of mushrooms, which I think to me is a often much more useful, I think, case study, historically grounded, theoretically rich sort of example of these sorts of things. And so I'm just kind of curious if occasionally in deploying terms like autopoiesis or this or that, you bump up against the ways in which an anthropocentrism gets smuggled back into some of these frameworks when we talk about how matter collaborates or how words collaborate with each other. We're trying to reverse these things, but we're still using words that are bound up with deeply human connotations. So Woolf is describing words that way because that's what humans do. We need to learn from words. And so I'm wondering if there's an irony there that in Woolf's work. So anyway, now I'm just rambling again, but I hope you see what I mean by being a grouchy Deleuzian. I'm deeply sympathetic to this framework and I deeply actually believe in it, but there's sort of a grouchiness sometimes that gets kicked up for me when I think about the ways I think we do tend to ascribe a human activity sometimes to something we're claiming is deeply non-human. And sometimes I worry about that. Not that I was hearing that in your papers, by the way. I want that to be clear. This is more just an open theoretical conversation. Stefano, your hand was up first, but I'm happy to hear from whoever.
Yeah, just respond.
Yeah, thanks, Benjamin. This is important issues to be talked about. And we have this project in Italy. It's in Italian, but we have come up with this post-humanism glossary, which tries to...
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, these terms very close to each other to see like differences or nuances, right. Because sometimes there is a slightly different perspective but still it's not absolute and blah, blah, blah. And but what I'm thinking is that so far I have found myself in a relaxed position when I discuss about this post-anthropocentrism or post-dualism, because this is, to me, the space which allows us to be conscious of the fact that as human beings, we cannot probably produce non-anthropocentric perspective, because this non implies that there's a zero anthropocentrism in it, and we cannot. I mean, this is my view at the moment. Instead, the post, and Francesca Ferranda explained this very well here, the post-anthropocentrism. Here is the possibility of challenging this. Stefan Sorgner, another important transhumanist, ethical transhumanist, talks about swing between this non and anthropocentrism and non-anthropocentrism, but we are still in this spatiality where we cannot get rid. But the fact that you are aware, it's already a lot of work. This is my position at the moment.
No, I appreciate that nuance, Stefano. Thank you. That's great.
And Savina, before you go, I'm also sympathetic, Stefano, to this idea that you can't dispense with some element of anthropocentrism. Like you can't, right? And anthropomorphism, and there is something about what we ask anthropomorphism to do, what anthropomorphism enables, right? And for that, sometimes I think it's really interesting to go back to those discourses of sensibility and sympathy that we see arising out of an 18th century context. And that might be of interest to you also, because I see in some of that a source of reconsiderations of what it is that we ask or assume that anthropomorphism does. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a figure of violence, but how we reconfigure that is of great interest to me. Yeah, Savina.
Yeah, concerning the contrast between using words differently, non-humanly, and the fact that words are the main mark of humanity, actually. Well, Woolf is ironic in the talk, and she's also ironic in her diary when she writes about the talk, and you can find, I guess, the quote in the paper I uploaded in the notes. She knows that, and she wonders if that's possible. She knows it is not possible to dismiss humanity. So you have to deal with that somehow, and trying to figure out a new way. And her, empathy towards other human beings, towards nature, which was, I guess, totally authentic, is really a kind of teaching for us all. And the way in which she tries to translate this into words is also something that we should keep on looking at. So
no, that's great. No, I appreciated the way also all the talks, and we can go, I don't need to keep yammering on, but I write a bit about a sketch of the past in the passage you draw our attention to, where Woolf talks about we are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. This is the philosophy, right, that she develops there. And a term that I had in mind for this panel that I was trying to ask a question about is how ontology fits into all of this, right? We're talking about ethics, we're talking about this and that, but it seems to me that Woolf is making an ontological point there.
Absolutely.
And her ontology, I think, is actually quite simple, right? It's not loaded with a lot of things, and it's sort of at the back of how she's thinking about moments of being in this moment in a sketch of the past, and why she's interested in moments of being. And in my work on that memoir, I argue that, the one principle for her in her ontology is that things, and we can define that loosely, her ontology is that things can be composed and decomposed and rearranged. And those things can be words, those things can be people, those things can be discourses, those things can be ideas, those things can be, right, whatever. But there's no automatically ethical component to it, right? We make the ethical response to that ontological principle, because she realizes this in the middle of a fight with her brother. It's clearly not an ethical moment, and yet she learns a kind of ethics from it. But this principle also undergirds her insights into how the Victorian machine works. It's a composition that runs and keeps running and repeating and differing as it goes. And she's able to see it because she's able to see how moments fit together, how things are pieced together, and how they can be pulled apart and reimagined and rearranged. And if there is a sort of fundamental ontological principle, and I think this was running across all papers, it seems to me that for Woolf, that's it. And that's a scary principle, but it's also a promising one if we're to make art, or to do politics, or to invent an ethics, or to think about the land, or to think about ourselves in relation to non-human things. It is, I think, runs across and under all of those areas of her writing. And now I'm learning also Vita's writing too. So Stefano, that I loved your presentation.
Yeah,
for that reason.
I'm quite excited to hear more about the land, Stefano, from you especially. So I want to make sure I'm able to sort of, I know that Victoria might also have other like moderating responsibilities. And so I want to give our wonderful host the opportunity to go. Right. So thank you so much, Tori. And thank you. You can stop the recording now, but thank you so much for enabling the transcript. That was brilliant. I was